Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual discussion with Steve Roberts. My name is Brooke Ballinger. I am the Director of Community Partnerships here at Kensington Park Senior Living. And we're so happy to have you all here for this discussion. And just a reminder that your cameras and mics are turned off, so we won't be able to hear or see the audience. But if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A chat box, and I'll save them to ask at the end of the presentation. So on behalf of Kensington Park Senior Living and our Executive Director, Mary Mel, we are so honored to welcome author, professor, and journalist Steve Roberts to discuss his new book, Cokie, A Life Well Lived. In this loving tribute to the legendary journalist Cokie Roberts and his wife of 53 years, Steve reflects not only on her many accomplishments as a trailblazing journalist, but also as a talented human being who proudly felt women were empowered to be the carriers of culture. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Steve Roberts.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Brooke. I'm delighted to be with you all and to talk to my friends at Kensington. I've been out there in person before. Today I have to be down in my downtown office here at George Washington University since I teach this afternoon. I'm still teaching a full load here at the university, but I do welcome the chance to speak to the residents and also to those of you who are tuning in over Zoom. You know, Cokie and I feel very deeply about this community that we all share. I still live in the house that Cokie and I lived in together for 42 years, but her family bought it in 1952. We go back a long, long time in this community. It's very important to us. And I thought I'd start by giving you a sense. You know, people know Cokie as this national figure, but and this famous celebrity. But the truth is her life was deeply rooted in this community in many, many ways. Starting historically, many of you probably don't know the fact that the first Claiborne, Cokie's middle name was Claiborne. Her full name was, as a child, was Corrine Claiborne Boggs. Her mother, Lindy, who many of you knew, was Lindy Claiborne, was her maiden name. And the first Claiborne to come to America landed in Jamestown in 1620. And in 1631, he sailed up the Chesapeake, landed on an island in the Chesapeake, which he named Kent Island, after his home parish in England. And he's universally recognized, William Claiborne, as the first white settler to set foot on what today is the state of Maryland. So those of us who live in Maryland, you can thank Cokie's direct ancestor for being the first white settler ever to set foot on this state. So you wonder, how did she know so much about politics and how did she know so much about this community? Well, family goes back a long, long time. In fact, there have been Claibornes in public office virtually every generation since then. And there's a story I tell in the book. There was a fellow named Steve Hess at the Brookings Institution who tried to do a book evaluating the prominence of different families in American political history. And the way he did it was to assign kind of a point value for every member of the family in terms of what office. So being a member of the House was certain points, senator certain points, president certain points. And so he finished his manuscript, and the Claibornes were actually number 3 in American political history, according to his calculations, behind only the Roosevelts and the Kennedys. So Cokie, in traditional fashion, those of you who knew Cokie can hear her saying this. Steve, she said, you have missed 5 members of my family, and I demand a recount. And she forced him to recalibrate his rankings. And today the Claibornes are number 2 in American political history, behind only the Roosevelts. And that's because the Roosevelts had 2 presidents. So that was kind of unfair. We've never had a Claiborne president. But if you want to know why did Cokie know so much about politics, you have to understand that this is the family business, and it's been the family business for centuries that the Claiborne family, her mother's family, has been involved in American public life for a long, long time. Her direct ancestor, William Cole Charles Claiborne, was the first governor of the Louisiana Territory. That's how the family got to Louisiana from Virginia. So they've been around a while. And we've been around this neighborhood for a while. When Cokie's dad, Hale Boggs, was a member of Congress, and in 1951, he ran for governor of Louisiana and lost. It was an off-year election, so he could keep his House seat. And so he, the family realized that they were going to be staying in Washington. This was going to be the focal point of their lives. And they had been renting houses over around the Connecticut Avenue neighborhood on Stevenson Place near Blessed Sacrament Parish there on Chevy Chase Circle. And they decided that Cokie and her sister were going to go to Stone Ridge School on Rockville Pike. Her brother was going to Georgetown Prep. So they decided they wanted to move closer to the schools. And that's when they looked at property in Bethesda. And the story is told, Cokie was 8 years old and she was in her snowsuit. And they were looking at this property on Bradley Boulevard, and Cokie sprawled herself in the front hallway and said to her mother, "My daddy's going to buy me this house." And her mother said, "No, he isn't. The closets are all wrong. The bathrooms are all wrong. He is not buying you this house." And Cokie, even then, at 8 years old, was fairly forceful. And she said, "Yes, he is. He's going to buy me this house." And in fact, he did. So in 1952, the family moved to this neighborhood, the house I still live in. And growing up, among the many people who came to visit the family out here, the legendary Speaker of the House was a man named Sam Rayburn. And Hale Boggs was a protege of Rayburn's. And all through the 50s, Rayburn was the Speaker. But he was a lonely man. He had married young. The marriage hadn't lasted. He never had children. And so pretty much once a week, at least, he would come out to the house on Bradley Boulevard and have dinner with Hale and Lindy and these three little kids who were running around. Cokie tells the story about at one point she had a chicken. She'd gotten an Easter chick. Someone had given her a chick, after Easter that was, for 20 cents or something on a post-Easter sale. And this chick actually grew up into a fairly sizable chicken, at which point he was attacked by the family dog and killed. So they had a little funeral ceremony out in the Bradley Boulevard in the yard. And Cokie's older brother, Tommy, who ran for Congress at one point in Montgomery County, didn't win, but he was the Democratic nominee in 1970. And he started singing Dragnet, the theme from Dragnet at the funeral. Cokie goes running into the house and Tommy is singing Dragnet at Charlie the Chicken's funeral, at which point the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, who was visiting that night, said, "I will take over." And he marches out and presides over a Baptist funeral for Charlie the Chicken, including, as legend has it, singing Amazing Grace. So you wonder why Cokie knew so much about politics when the Speaker of the House presides over the funeral of your baby chicken when you're 10 or 11 years old. This does have a big effect. And Cokie went to Stone Ridge School out in Rockville Pike, graduated from there in 1960. Deeply loyal to that school her whole life. In fact, the family has recently contributed to the Capitol campaign and the new theater. As some of you know, the new theater at Stone Ridge School is the Cokie Roberts class of 1960 theater, because we decided that that would be the focal point of our philanthropy, because she was so devoted to that school and to the nuns who taught her. And, Cokie said all of her life she was a very devout Catholic, but she also was very clear-eyed about how difficult it could be to be a believing Catholic as an independent woman in modern America, when women were condemned to a second-class citizenship in the Catholic Church. And when Cokie often said, the nuns told us we could grow up to be anything we wanted except priests. And that was always an issue that deeply wounded Cokie. In fact, in a number of interviews, she was once asked, "What would you do to change the Catholic Church?" And split second later, she said, ordained women. So, but because Stone Ridge was a Catholic institution run by and for women, she found a real spiritual home there, not just an education, but a spiritual home, and deeply devoted to that school her entire life. One of the last things she did before she died was to make a fundraising video and was the honorary chairman of the Capital Campaign at Stone Ridge. So that's just one more way in which her life and was so deeply entwined in this community we all share. And she was the first child in her family. Her older sister Barbara, older brother Tommy, had all gone to Catholic high schools, but also Catholic colleges. So Cokie in 1960 was the first and only one of the three children to go to a non-Catholic school. And she went to Wellesley. The story I tell in the book was her mother, Lindy, who some of you remember, was a little unsettled and about this departure from family tradition, but she managed to contain her feelings until they had driven Cokie to school in the fall of 1960. It was a pretty busy time. It was the Kennedy campaign. Hal and Lindy were both deeply involved in the Kennedy campaign, in part because Kennedy, of course, was the first Catholic president, but it went beyond that, and deeply loyal to the Democratic Party. Their lifelong friend Lyndon Johnson was vice presidential candidate. So, but they managed to find time to drive Cokie to school. And Lindy managed to contain her misgivings until they were driving off the campus. And she turned to my father-in-law, burst into tears and said, "I've left my baby at a Yankee Protestant Republican school." Now, I always asked Lindy, who I was deeply devoted to, what was the worst of those three? And she always had a different answer for that. Now, the Jewish son-in-law, that was strike four. I was still not even in the picture. But Cokie was deeply shaped by this community and the schools and the community that she grew up in here. And we met just 2 years later, between the summer of our sophomore and junior years in college. We met at a student political meeting at Ohio State University. And we got back to campus. Our dorms, it turned out, were only about 12 miles apart. I was at Harvard, she was at Wellesley in Boston. And we went out a few times that fall, but I was a typical guy and I stopped calling because I was a jerk. And I had never had a serious girlfriend before. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what I was doing. But I knew I was petrified, although deeply attracted to this brilliant, beautiful young woman, but not sure how to handle myself. And so I didn't call for 3, 4, 5 months. And that spring of 1963, there was another student political meeting here in Washington. And Cokie and I both arranged to come to Washington separately to come to this meeting. And it turns out we were going to share a car, that someone else was driving, and we sort of were all both going to be in this car. And I remember very clearly approaching the car. It was parked on a side street of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I was at school. And as I approached the car, I saw that Cokie was sitting in the back seat. And I saw her through the window. And I said to myself, "You idiot. This is the girl. What the heck have you been doing?" So I got in the car, we drove down here, and this was the first time I came to Bethesda. First time I came to Maryland. First time I came to this community. I had just turned 20 years old. And I'm 79 now, so do the math. And not only were we sharing a car, but a whole bunch of us were supposed to stay at Cokie's house at Bradley Boulevard. But one by one, each of the other guys who was supposed to stay had decided not to come on this trip for whatever reason. So it turns out I was the only guy staying at this house. And I continued to come because I was covering the event for the Harvard student newspaper. So my first night in Bradley Boulevard, first night, house I still live in, I'm coughing terribly. And I hear a knock on the door. Now, it's 1963. I figure it's probably not Cokie, although I was in her girlhood room, later our daughter's girlhood room. In walks my future mother-in-law, future member of Congress, 18-year member of Congress, future ambassador to the Vatican, Lindy Boggs, in an off-the-shoulder, peach-colored negligee, saying, "Why, darling," Lindy's universal form of address, "why, darling, you sound terrible. Drink this," and hands me a glass, which I'm sure was about 2/3 bourbon. I was in shock. I was in shock. I had never met a woman like Lindy Boggs before in my life. And the joke in the family is I fell in love with my mother-in-law first and eventually got around to Cokie, which is at least partly true. But that was my first night in Bradley Boulevard. First night. Second night, next night, Saturday night, Cokie and I stayed up all night talking in the den of the house. And she was Catholic, as I've mentioned. I was Jewish, as I've mentioned. And so our families never thought this could work. Our friends never thought this could work. But that night, we stayed up all night talking. And for the first time, we started to see, very dimly, we started to see a path forward for us together. And we're together from that weekend on. There were bumps in the road, but we're together. And so that's why our wedding rings, I still wear it. Our wedding rings are inscribed "Forever Spring," because it was that spring when we fell in love. Spring of our junior years in junior year in college. Now, it took me a couple more years to get around to actually marrying her, but that weekend at Bradley Boulevard really was the turning point in our relationship. And so when we finally did get married in 1966, we talked a lot about how could we use the ceremony to symbolize our merging of our two faiths. We were working very, very hard at convincing our parents that this could work. And actually, the biggest resistance came not from the Boggses, but from my family. They were all immigrants from Eastern Europe. In fact, both of my grandfathers fled the Tsar's army in the early part of the 20th century. The hunger and yearning of the Russian Empire to acquire territory in the West, as they're doing in Ukraine as we speak, is not new. My grandfathers left to escape the Tsar's army as the Tsar gobbled up territory in Belarus, Poland in those years. So there's nothing new about what we're seeing, but my grandparents, while they were not religious in a ritual sense, were very tribally Jewish. That's how I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey. I was very deeply devoted to my traditions and my tribe. In fact, that's part of what Cokie and I saw in each other. Even though our tribes were different, our devotion to tradition was similar. And so we had tried very hard to convince my parents that this match would work. And at one point, I got a 5-page single-spaced letter from my father telling me this could never work and that this is an impossible idea. But then, of course, Cokie Boggs and Lindy Boggs decided to exert all of their considerable charm on my father. And you can imagine the man was helpless in the face of this charm offensive of two of the most powerful women you could ever meet anywhere. And it finally, not long before this wedding, my father finally said to me, "You know, Stephen, it would be a whole lot easier to oppose this marriage if it wasn't so obvious she's the perfect girl for you." And he was right about that. But the wedding was difficult because of merging these faiths, merging these traditions. We tried as hard as we possibly could to respect everybody's faith. And Lindy had always assumed Cokie would be married at a church, Blessed Sacrament or Lady of Lourdes, or Little Flower, any of the neighborhood churches. And Cokie said, "No, Mama, I can't do that. Stephen still has these two grandfathers alive who fled religious persecution, Eastern Europe. It would be uncomfortable for them to come to a church." And Lindy said, "Of course, darling, I understand completely." So we got married in the garden of our home. We had a priest, Cokie's uncle, who was a Jesuit. But we had a lot of Jewish rituals. We had a Jewish chuppah. Jewish wedding canopy. We had trouble getting a rabbi to come because at that stage, very few rabbis would participate in interfaith marriages. It's very different today, but 1966 was very difficult. Finally, my mother came up with the brilliant solution. She said at one point, Stephen, a rabbi is really just an elder of the tribe. He's not a priest in the Christian sense. And so why don't you get a Jewish elder, like say, for instance, Arthur Goldberg. Now, Arthur Goldberg had been on the Supreme Court. He just left the court to become American ambassador to the United Nations with the hope of running for governor of New York, which he eventually did run, did not win, but did run for governor. In any case, Justice Goldberg came to the wedding and gave a wonderful talk about Jewish teachings on marriage. And he said, I can't pretend to be a rabbi, but I can be an elder. And that's all we wanted. I wanted my grandparents, my parents, their friends to be feeling respected and comfortable and fully embraced at this important moment. And that's what happened. And so this community is not only where we really first talked out our potential future on Bradley Boulevard, we got married there. And in fact, we had our 50th wedding anniversary, 50 years to the day after we got married. We got married on September 10th, 1966. And on September 10th, 2016, 50 years later, we had our 50th wedding anniversary celebration on the exact spot where we were married. So kind of people of tradition and people who believe in these basic verities and these strong ideas. And so Bradley Boulevard was in this community very, very important to us. In fact, even before we were married, in those years after we graduated, because we didn't get married till 2 years after we graduated, Cokie moved back into Bradley Boulevard. I came down here to Washington to work for the New York Times Bureau after we graduated, and Cokie went to work for a small TV production company who ran a quiz show, which is actually still on the air on WRC, the NBC affiliate here in Washington, called It's Academic. It's a high school quiz show. And that was her first job in television. But the woman who ran that company, Sophie Altman, was the first of many, many TV producers to understand that they were dealing with this mega talent, Cokie Boggs, even though she was untrained. She had a magical affinity for the camera. The camera loved her, and she loved the camera. And so when Cokie was 22 years old, the second year after we graduated, 1965, 66, Sophie Altman sold a second show to WRC, the NBC station here, called Meeting of the Minds. It was a Sunday morning talk show, and Cokie Boggs was the host. Most people have no idea that this was her first time on television, but at age 22, she was hosting her own TV show. In fact, this show was on WRC on Sunday morning. It was the lead-in to Meet the Press. Then we got married at the end of that year, and it was a measure of life in 1966 that we never even had a conversation about whose job was more important. I was going to work on the city staff in the New York Times in New York, and arguably her job was at least as prominent, if not more important than mine. But 1966, we just automatically assumed that the man's job was more important. And we moved to New York after we got married, and Cokie was very frank about how depressing and how frustrating it was for her to try to look for a job. At one point, she kept looking for jobs and went going to magazines and places, and she was told over and over again, we do not hire women to be writers, as if there was some genetic inhibition. And that is a woman who eventually wrote five national best-selling books. So I think she proved those editors wrong. But at the time, it was an enormously dispiriting and depressing experience to go through, which she was very frank about, and how frustrating it would be, because even though she had grown up at a time when it was still assumed that, in her own words, that her ambitions were not to have a career, her ambitions were to maybe work for a few years, get married, support her husband, have children. But at the same time, this was such a powerful intellect and such a powerful personality that she was never going to be satisfied with that life. And so she was grappling with the limits and the limits of marriage, the limits of sexism, the limits of history. And that was true for the next 11 years because for 11 years, we left Washington. We went to New York, then we went to Los Angeles for my job as the Los Angeles bureau chief of the New York Times, then went to Europe, worked in Greece. And Cokie's first breakthrough as a journalist came when we moved to Athens. She had been producing TV shows in Los Angeles, where we had been we lived for 5 years, and but when we moved to Athens, she couldn't produce television shows there, right? So she decided that she would try to hook on with one of the big networks as sort of a part-time reporter. The phrase is a stringer, and so she actually had an agreement with CBS that she could do some work for CBS, and so they actually gave her a tape recorder and said, well, we'll try you out. I have a letter that I quote in the book where she writes home to her girlhood friend, Cinda Pratt, who she went to Stone Ridge with. They've given me, a tape recorder and they're going to try me out. And if I do a good job, they'll take me on. And when you think about what happened to her, the letter is pretty prescient. We hadn't been in Athens more than a few months, and got the kids in school. Our kids were only 3 and 5 at the time. And so she cables CBS and says, okay, I'm ready to do some work for you. Not more than a week later, there is a coup in the island nation of Cyprus. Left-wing government is overthrown by right-wing military junta, and all the reporters in the Western world, and that part of the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, flocked to Cyprus, including me, and including CBS's main correspondent in Athens. 2 days later, the Turks invade Cyprus to overturn the coup. Cokie gets a cable from CBS saying, the Turks have invaded Cyprus, can you file in 30 minutes? At that point in her life, Cokie Roberts had never done a radio report in her life. Now think about one of the founding mothers of NPR, but at that moment had never done a radio report in her life. She figures out, she goes down to the Reuters office where I had made my base. She figures out how to do this, files a radio report. 2 days later, the Greek government, which was a military government at the time, starts falling because of the aftershocks of the invasion. And suddenly, the decline of the military government in Athens is the biggest story in the world. But all the other reporters, me, the CBS guy, and everybody else, we're stuck in Cyprus. Cokie's virtually the only English language reporter in Athens, and the border's closed, the airport's closed, no one can get in. And so she tells the story of, she was in downtown Athens near the central square, and the place just explodes with cheering and music, and it's just been announced that the military government, which had ruled Greece at that point for 7 or 8 years, had collapsed, and the democratic politicians were taking over the government. And as I say, biggest story in the world. That night, Greece, a NATO country. Cokie leaps out of her taxi cab as she tells the story, and holds her tape recorder up to get all the sound from the cheering and the celebrations. And then she goes to a flower stall, which is along the main square of Athens. Any of you who've ever been there, there are a series of flower stalls, and she gets into one of the flower stalls and commandeers a phone. Now, in those old days, this clunky old tape recorder that she had, in order to get her audio through a phone line, she had to take what are called alligator clips, these wires with clips on the end. One side of the clips went into the tape recorder. The other, she had to take apart the speaker end of the phone and clip these clips inside to the terminals. And the guy who's running the flower stall thinks she's a CIA agent, goes crazy and says, you know, you got to stop. And Cokie said, no, 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 I'll buy plenty of flowers from you. She gets her report out. That night, CBS calls her mother, calls Lindy, and says, do you have a picture of your daughter? And Lindy's panicked, said, what's wrong? What's wrong? And they said, no, no, there's nothing wrong. It's just that Cokie's radio report is the only report we have out of Athens tonight. And it's going to lead the Walter Cronkite show, the evening news. But we want to put a picture up while we play the audio. Second night as a CBS reporter, she leads the Cronkite show. For the next week, I'm stuck in Cyprus. I have no idea this is going on. I get a phone line for 15 minutes a day, and I got to use it to call my office in New York. Finally, I get out of Cyprus. No commercial airlines are flying, but I get a military flight to UK, then back to Athens. I walk through the door and find I'm married to a veteran foreign correspondent. She'd been on the air continuously for those 8 days. Right place, right time, but she was so talented that she seized that moment. And, but still, she was only a part-timer. She was still trying to establish her reputation. And a year or two later, we moved back to Washington here. We moved into Bradley Boulevard, which we thought would be for a month while we looked for another house. It became immediately clear to us. Lindy was living there alone. Lindy had become a member of Congress after her husband Hale had been killed in 1972 in a plane crash. Lindy was living in this big suburban house by herself. We had 2 kids. They were 7 and 9 by this point. It was a great school district. It immediately became clear that what made sense was for us to buy the house from Lindy, and she could use our down payment to buy an apartment for herself downtown, which is what she did. So we moved back into Bradley Boulevard. And but Cokie was very unhappy about being back in Washington. She felt that, you know, once we came back that we would never leave, which of course turned out to be true. And she was very worried about could she make it in Washington journalism. She had never been, even with, at that point, she had never been a full-time working journalist. Everything she had done had been part-time. Everything she'd been done hit or miss while she was taking care of the kids. So my first day back in the Washington Bureau of the Times, I walk in and I'm given a desk and I sit down. And there's a young woman at the adjoining desk who I don't recognize. And I say to her, I introduce myself. And she said her name is Judy Miller, later a rather infamous figure in Washington journalism for a variety of reasons. And I said, gee, I don't recognize your name. You're new to the paper. And she said, yes. I said, where did you used to work? And she said, National Public Radio. And I said, what's that? Because NPR had been in existence for 6 years at that point, but for 4 of those years, we'd been in Europe. I had no idea what she's talking about. She starts explaining to me what NPR is, and I instinctively said, oh my God, that's the perfect place for my wife to work. I mean, I've got this wife's crying herself to sleep in Bethesda every night. What do I do? And Judy said, you call my friend Nina Totenberg, a name very well known to many of you to this day, was then and is to this day the Supreme Court correspondent of NPR and one of our dearest friends. I'm having dinner with her tomorrow night. And so I call Nina and she says, I know who you are. We'd never met. She said, I know who you are. I know who Cokie is. Get me Cokie's resume tomorrow. And so I marched out of the next day. I walked 2 blocks from the New York Times Bureau to NPR on 22nd Street and M, downtown Washington. And Nina meets me out front and I hand Nina Cokie's resume. And the rest, as they say, is history. But what is very significant about that moment is this was the first moment I saw the old girls network at work. Women doing for each other what men had always done for each other. Because NPR was new, it had more women. It was much more agile. It was much more nimble than hidebound traditional news organizations that had always had white men running everything. NPR didn't. And so with Nina's help, Linda Wertheimer's help, they got Cokie hired on, initially just as a part-timer. But within a couple of months, they kind of knew the talent that they were dealing with. And there was a moment that was very important in our careers and our relationship. There was the meltdown at the nuclear power plant, the 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Cokie had gone to the office very early that morning and immediately had been sent by NPR, get in the car and get to 3 Mile Island. A couple hours later, I go to the New York Times office and they say, get in your car and go to 3 Mile Island. And I said, no. We've got 2 kids at home. It's unfair for both of us to be there in a situation of that danger. That was the first moment, 11 years after we were married on Bradley Boulevard. That was the first moment where her career took precedent over mine. It was not the last, but it was the first. And it's symbolic of the ways our careers and our lives started intersecting. And you're familiar with the history. She worked for NPR for 10 years and then ABC came calling. And they were under a lot of pressure to put more women in more prominent positions in their Sunday show, which was dominated by 3 white men, David Brinkley, George Will, Sam Donaldson. And so they were trying out various women as potential regulars on the show. And so they invited Cokie for a one-off. Everybody knew it was an audition, but there were no promises. At this point, she was in her 40s. She was a grown-up. And so she marches in there, and the young producer who was on duty tells me the story. Cokie introduces herself and says, Mark, there are 3 things you need to know about me. I've been married to the same man for 20 years. I live in the house I grew up in, and I go to church every Sunday. And if you understand those 3 things about me, we're going to get along fine. Mark said, in all the years I knew you, Steve, nothing ever changed in that story except the number of years you were married. Otherwise, it was the same story. That's who she was. That's who she wanted to be. That's who she was proud of being. She was proud of being a mother. She was proud of living in the family home. She was proud of being a Catholic. She was proud of being a traditional woman. But she was also proud of being a pioneer, because not only did she break a lot of glass ceilings, but she brought a lot of women along with her. And she had this very profound sense of obligation wherever she went to promote other women, to help other women, to counsel other women. She was unusual in those years because so many of the women who had made their way in television, first of all, there weren't that many of them. And many of them who were, there's a phrase I had never known before I did this book called news nuns. And the news nuns were the women who decided that they had to make a choice between career and family. And they were the ones who, to the extent there were women in the hierarchy at ABC and any other news organization, those were the dominant figures. And for Cokie to come along as, not only as a longtime wife, but as a mother and eventually a grandmother, was enormously powerful model for these young women who wanted that life but didn't have the models. And in writing this book, I spent a lot of time, as I have this morning, talking about her public career, but I came to understand that really the private Cokie was as important as the public Cokie, in some ways even more important. Yes, there were women all over America who watched Cokie on TV and said, I can be that smart, I can be that strong. Cokie is asking the questions I want to ask. Cokie is speaking for me. Cokie is my model. Cokie is my hero. I've heard that constantly. But it's also true that Cokie lived the gospel. She did go to church every Sunday. She was shaped by the nuns at Stone Ridge. And that meant that she was going to be a friend and a good person. Every single day of her life, she did something for other people on a private basis. And the fact is that not everybody can be a TV star. But everybody can be a good person. Everybody can learn something about how to live their lives from the private Cokie, not just the public Cokie. And I heard stories that I'd never heard before. because I wasn't there when Cokie swooped up every baby in the zip code in every maternity ward. I was not there when she went to the funeral of her friend's parents. I was not there at her offices at NPR and ABC, where there were literally lines of young women stretching down the corridor seeking her advice and her counsel. And people asked me how she did it. How could this woman, who then, of course, went on to yet another career as a best-selling author beyond her radio career and her TV career and her book writing career, and then she became joined the board of Save the Children and went all over the world advocating for women and children's welfare all over the world. I mean, you could say she had 4 different careers. And yet, how did she have time to be a mother? How did she have time to be a wife? How did she have time to be such a good friend? Well, there's a story that I tell in the book. It's a woman named Jane Ayler. She was the deputy bureau chief at ABC. She had lost a younger brother. She was bereft. It was a sudden death, and she was just absolutely crushed by this. And after being away for a couple of weeks, she came back to work. First morning back at work, Cokie appears in her doorway. Jane told me the story. Cokie walks in, closes the door, and says, "Jane, talk to me." Jane collapses in grief, sobbing, talking for an hour. And she says to Cokie, "You're the busiest person I know. How can you have an hour to spend with me?" Cokie looked at her and said, "Jane, right now, the most important thing I can do is to be your friend and be here with you." And that's how she did it. She did it because she understood her priorities. She could have done 100 other things in that hour, but for that hour, being a friend to that woman in need was the most important thing she did. We all get 24 hours a day, and Cokie used them in that way. She set her priorities. She knew what was important, and she did this over and over and over again. The story that Nina Totenberg told me. Nina's husband, who was much older than she, her first husband, had died, and it was a very complicated situation. Cokie, quoting Nina, said, "Cokie ran Floyd's death. Cokie arranged for the funeral. Cokie arranged for him to be buried at Arlington. He was a World War II combat veteran. Final task was to pick out a casket. They go down to Gawler's funeral home. Unfortunately, we all know where that is. And Cokie says, "Well, I'll come with you to pick out a casket." Now think of what a gesture of friendship it is, to go with your friend to pick out her husband's casket. They get there, and the salesman's trying to sell them a more expensive version. And he says to Nina, "Miss Totenberg, you know, your husband was a very tall man, so he'll be much more comfortable in this more expensive casket." Cokie and Nina catch each other's eyes and burst out laughing. Now, what kind of friend not only goes with you to pick out a casket, but can laugh with you over the casket? Pretty good friend. And so many of her friends said to me in one form or another, you know, Steve, her girlhood friend, Cinda Pratt Perlman, said to me, you know, "I don't want one of those bracelets that says WWJD, what would Jesus do? I want a bracelet that says WWCD, what would Cokie do?" And I know a great many people who take that as their watchword, including me. As I was writing this book, my younger brother, Glenn, who lived in Garrett Park and not very far at all from their facility, been suffering from Parkinson's for a long time. His wife called me and said, "We almost lost him last night. We want to see him one more time. Get here today." So I went over, held his hand, kissed him goodbye. Next morning, the phone rings at 6 o'clock in the morning, and it can't be good news at 6 o'clock. Pretty much knew before I picked up the phone what it was. My sister-in-law says he died overnight, and now you can go back to bed. I'm sitting there with my phone in my hand, and I said to myself, what would Cokie do? I didn't go back to bed. I dressed, got up, started driving toward, only 15 minutes away, to my brother and sister-in-law's house. On the way, I called my sister, who lives in Boston. I knew that she had heard of our brother's death. And I said to her, "Laura, I'm heading to Glenn's house now, and I'm going there because that's what Cokie would do. She said, Stephen, you have it wrong. Cokie would have been there last night sleeping on the couch. She was certainly right about that. So later in the day, I'm talking to my son. I tell him the story. Tell him what his Aunt Laura said. My son Lee said, Dad, you're both wrong. Mom would have been there the last 3 nights sleeping on the couch. What would Cokie do? She would have been there the last 3 nights sleeping on the couch. It's nothing to do with being a best-selling author. It's nothing to do with being a TV celebrity. It has nothing to do with being one of the living legends, as the Library of Congress called her. Nothing to do with being one of the 50 most prominent women in the history of radio and television. None of that. It has to do with being a friend. That's the most important lesson in the book. So I'm delighted to be with you. And if there are any questions, Brooke, that I can answer, I'm happy to try.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Steve. I think I speak for everyone when I say it's pretty incredible to hear this insight on Cokie's life from the very beginning and the impact that she made. And we do have a couple questions from the audience. The first one, Mary from Rockville, and you kind of touched on this. She said, from your journalistic perspective, might you expand on this women and NPR confluence to greatness?
Well, there were several dimensions to this. One was internal to NPR and one was external. As I mentioned, NPR was new, and it was, the 2 blocks away from the NPR headquarters where the New York Times was based. The New York Times had white, male, Ivy League educated White House correspondents for 100 years. There were these encrusted stereotypes and prejudices about what a White House correspondent looked and sounded like. NPR was new. It was, and it didn't have those same stereotypes, those same prejudices. Nina Totenberg always said, yeah, and we didn't pay very well, so that helped attract more women, and that was certainly part of it. Wasn't the whole story, though, because Nina and Linda and Cokie were right at the cusp of this wave of women coming into the not only journalism business, many other businesses. They had been fully educated. They had equal to the men in terms of intelligence, education, and so NPR had the advantage of being new and being nimble and being able to see the value of having these women, and that the networks were much slower. I mean, it took 10 more years for ABC to really understand Cokie's value, 10 years. But it was not just internally, it was externally. Cokie often told the story about the difference it made to have women in the press corps. And one of her best examples was she was covering for NPR a big budget conference. And the big issue that everybody was focused on that year was whether there was going to be funding in the budget for a certain kind of missile, the MX missile. And that was the subject everybody was interested in. So the budget negotiators come out of the meeting and everybody's shouting questions. Is money for the missile in the bill? Is money for the missile in the bill? And Cokie gets up and says, is money for mammograms in the bill? That was only a question a woman would ask. And having women in the press corps reflecting the interests of women, reflecting the concerns of half the population was titanic in terms of its impact. And in some ways that was, so it was not just that within NPR, there was much more equality in terms of gender, but it was then what that meant in terms of the coverage, what that meant not just on NPR, but in the press corps in general. Because having women like Cokie speaking and asking and focusing on stories like funding for mammograms was a sea change in the whole way Washington journalism did business.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Judy in Bethesda. She says, Steve, might you touch a bit more on your co-authoring time with Cokie? How did your styles mesh and then develop?
Well, thanks for that question. We started writing together very young. When we were in Los Angeles, and Cokie was producing TV shows sort of part-time. I was the Times correspondent, as I said. The world was focused on Southern California. We got there in 1969. It was the age of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was a huge story. It was a great story. I couldn't cover everything I was asked to cover. I was getting all of these offers to do magazine pieces. And so Cokie was working part-time, should work hard for 2 weeks on our TV show and then should be kind of bored for 2 weeks. So we hit on the scheme where we would write these magazine articles together. She would do the research, I'd write, she'd edit it, and would have a double byline. And she herself, this is her quote, she herself called it a one-man journalism school. And so that's really how we started. And then, but I always respected her judgment so much, and she respected mine. I mean, it was part of our relationship from the very beginning, apart from all the normal hormonal impulses of young people in their 20s. There was this deep respect for each other's views and writing ability. So we meshed pretty well. The truth is, a lot of couples do not mesh well. I mean, there's a legendary story of President Carter, Jimmy Carter, and Rosalind Carter almost killing each other when they try to write a book together. And I know a lot of couples who say this is the last thing in the world they would do, but we always enjoyed it. And we started in California. When we went to Europe, Cokie said, now I'm ready to start writing on my own. And she did write a bunch of articles by herself, but we wrote several together. We wrote a big New York Times Sunday magazine piece on an archaeological dig in the island of Santorini together. We did some travel pieces together. But when we came back to Washington, we started writing newspaper columns together. We wrote more than 1,000 newspaper columns together. And then she started writing books. And one of the things that we learned was we edit each other gently. We had such a respect for each other that, we did edit each other, but we were trying to be careful and respectful. And when she wrote her first book, We Are Our Mother's Daughters, one of the chapters was about wife. I mean, that was the name of the chapter. And so she handed it to me and said, Stephen, I need you to edit this. And I said, wait, just a minute. I want to know the ground rules here, because I want to know what you expect from me. Do you want a light edit or do you want a real edit? I was not about to step over this line without warning. And she said, no, Stephen, I don't have time for you to fool around. I need a real edit. Okay. I read it, and it wasn't as good as she could write. It was flat. She'd written it too fast. She had such a natural bounce and ebullience to her style. It was naturally so funny. And this didn't reflect that because it was just written too fast, right on the deadline. So I took this deep breath and I said, darling, I think you can do a lot better than this. And she said, Stephen, I just reread it and you're right. Now I said, shoot, I dodged a very large, I can still feel that bullet whizzing past my left ear here. But we had an understanding, but there is a final story that's really actually kind of funny about this. Cokie had written, when we were very young, a Haggadah. Some of you know that the Haggadah is the book that the Passover Seder for Jews is read every year. It contains the prayers, the stories, the rituals. Even though she was a Catholic, she embraced my Judaism with great fervor. We always used to say she was the best Jew in the family. She always used to say there was not a lot of competition for the title, but in fact, she was a devout person. She was a believer in ritual, and so she embraced Passover in particular. She wrote a Haggadah for us, which she had pieced together from various pieces, and it was what the family used in our Seders for many, many years, 25 years or more. People in the Jewish book world heard about this manuscript and came to us and said, why don't you publish this as a book? Because there are a lot of Haggadahs, but there's not one really aimed at interfaith families. So we agreed to do this. I picked up the manuscript that she had written all those years ago. And I felt she could use some freshening. Some of the language was kind of stiff and archaic. I start editing it. She is furious with me. Stephen, this is sacred text. You can't change a word. I did not stay happily married for 53 years to ignore Cokie Roberts when she was that forceful. Not anyway, but certainly when she's not that forceful. Okay, darling, whatever you say. And then she starts editing the text. And I said, well, Cokie, you told me this was sacred text and I couldn't change a word. She said, that's right, Stephen. I told you you couldn't change a word, but because I wrote it, I can change it. We came to a détente. But bottom line is we loved writing together. And because we learned from each other, you know, in any good marriage, you learn from each other. You try to adopt each other's best qualities. And that happened on many levels with us, but writing was one of them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. I think we're running out of time here, but we really want to thank Steve and
No,
our.
you can ask me one or two. Come on. You can
All
ask
right,
me
let's
one or
leave.
two.
We do have one more. If you sure you have time.
Yeah, I do.
All right, this last one is Carol in Potomac. She says, what other Steve Roberts projects or programs might we have to look forward to next?
Well, you know, after Cokie wrote her final book, Capital Dames, which is about the women of Washington during the Civil War, and it was a very difficult project for her for a variety of reasons. We had several tragic deaths in the family that year, and her brother, my brother. And so, and she was working under a terrible deadline because the publisher wanted to bring it out during the in 2015, during the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And she often said, you know, she went on book tour to promote that book, and people would say to her, well, Mrs. Roberts, what's your next project? And she said, asking me that is like asking a mother who's just had triplets, when are you going to have another baby? So I feel that this book is sort of I've been building up for this book for a long time. I poured my heart and soul into it. Whether there's another book project in me, I'm not sure, but I continue to write, you know, a column for Bethesda Magazine. I've got a new column in the magazine that's just out this week about a wonderful woman named Ellen Oh, who's Korean American, who has written children's books based on Korean fables and with Korean American characters. And as she said to me many times, you know, I wanted books my children could read that had characters that looked like them. And one of my great motivations here in writing about Montgomery County is to celebrate the diversity of our county. People don't realize, everybody has this image of Montgomery County as a sort of white, rich place, and it is the 11th richest county in America, but it's also the most diverse county in America. Silver Spring, by many accounts, is the most diverse city in the entire country. We are very blessed here, very blessed to have such a rich diversity. And so I try to use my writing and my columns to evoke that community and that diversity. And Ellen's just the latest of many, many people I've written about over the years. So that continues to be an important project of mine. I continue to be the political analyst for ABC Radio. I was on the radio covering the State of the Union the other night. I continue to teach. I'm here in my office at George Washington University. I still teach full-time here in the School of Media and Public Affairs. I'll be teaching this afternoon. And yes, according to this, people have asked me in the chat, do you still have a dog? And the answer is absolutely. A wonderful chocolate lab named Rosie. One of the tragic ironies of the last few years is we had a chocolate lab named Ella who died literally the day before Cokie did. And I was, you know, coming into that big empty house on Bradley Boulevard by myself. I have a wonderful niece who lives here in our community, Elizabeth Davidson. Her dog and our dog were litter mates. They were identical. And so I said to Elizabeth, I need Ivy, your dog. And so Ivy came to live with me for a month or so. And then Elizabeth appointed herself head of the committee to get me a new dog. And so she found me Rosie. And so, yes, you can see me walking her through the neighborhood most days if I have the time. But, you know, some of you remember one of our dogs named Abner was a basset hound. I'll tell this final story because it kind of sums up in a way our life here in Bethesda, and how we've always tried to just be good neighbors and local folks and try to not let all of this Washington celebrity go to our heads. After we wrote a book about interfaith marriage called From This Day Forward, which did very well in the New York Times bestseller list for a couple of months. And we went on Larry King's show on CNN one night. And Larry is talking about how, well, this is Washington's premier power couple. And, you know, if you wanted to let that go to your head, you know, be stupid to do it. But we all know people who have. We get home. Abner, our aging basset hound, has pooped all over the kitchen floor on Bradley Boulevard. And so Cokie and I are down on our hands and knees, scrubbing the floor and saying, how does it feel to be Washington's power couple now? It was the perfect antidote. So we're neighbors, we're friends, and we love living here. And we appreciate the fact that so many of you have been our friends and neighbors for so long.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to our 60 plus combined attendees on Zoom and here at Kensington Park. We actually have 2 signed copies, thanks to Steve, of Cokie, A Life Well Lived. So we'll be doing a drawing out of the attendees and be sending those books to your house. But thank you again, Steve, for sharing Cokie's story. And I know she continues to have an impact on so many lives. And thanks for keeping her legacy alive and speaking with us today.
My pleasure, Brooke.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.